All right, so what I want to talk about first, because work in process inventory is so crucial to process costing, but there are processes that don't have a work in process inventory because they're services, all right? Or they're just in time and they don't really keep those inventories, they just do it and pass it on. So you can still use the process costing approach, and examples would be things like check processing in a bank, changing the oil, checking baggage, dry cleaning. All right, so we could do that. Also, just-in-time manufacturing firms do this. All right, so because they strive to minimize inventories, they may work with no work-in-process inventory. JIT. All right. Now, if you do have work-in-process inventories, the first thing you have to understand is physical flow and equivalent units. All right? So, I think we've discussed how we have an assembly line. Let's come back to our calculators. All right? So you can imagine an assembly line where every little separate button and that package looks like there's 2 pieces of plastic and there's 6 little screws in the back and there's a screen, and you know inside there's some kind of little microprocessor chip, right, or 2 or 3, and a little processor that collects the solar energy so it doesn't need a battery. So there's all these little pieces. So you can imagine in the assembly process for this, somebody at the front of the line pulls the pieces they need to make the calculator, and maybe they start with the inside with the little solar cell and the microprocessor chip, and they weld them to a little board and they send it on down to the person who puts the plastic around it, and then they send it to the person who puts the buttons on, right? All right, so you can imagine this flow, right? So obviously at the end of the flow, when the calculator comes off, you're done, and it's going to go on to packaging, right, or whatever. All right, so you can imagine this physical flow that there's direct material, direct labor, and overhead coming in, and it flows and it gets more and more and more finished as it goes, right? So we talk about equivalent units because not everything is going to be a complete full unit, right? So what we do is calculate equivalent units based on how far along they're done. So every transferred out unit is 1 unit, an equivalent unit. So when it's done and it goes on to packaging, that's 1, right? So I say how many equivalent units went to packaging? 50, right? If 50 calculators were completed and went to packaging, that's 50 equivalent units, right? That's easy. We just call it equivalent. It's really just a unit. But what about all those calculators on the assembly line? And like at the beginning of the assembly line, it's just a bunch of chips and buttons. And at the end of the assembly line, you've got something that looks like this, but it just doesn't have its plus key. It's like 99% done, right? So what you have to do is, and I wouldn't make you do this for class, but you have to estimate how much completed they are. Are they 20%, 50%, right? And you come up with this number and you say, okay, well, we've got 100 calculators on the assembly line. Some are just starting, some are almost done, but there's 100 of them there. And they're 20% complete or 40% complete. They just need their conversion, right? Because all the direct materials are here. Right? We've pulled all the little buttons and chips and plastic, and it's on the assembly line. There's 100 of them. So direct material, 100%. But the conversion cost, the putting it together, the adding the overhead, we've only got 20% of that done, or 30%, right? So you have to estimate that. So that is what's going on. That's physical flow and equivalent units. All right. So the first 2 steps in building that production report is preparing the physical flow schedule. So you actually say, how many did we have in beginning work in process? How many came in? How many flowed out? How many are left in work in process, right? You get the physical flow. And once you understand the physical flow of how many things came and went, now you can come up with an equivalent unit based on, that's the equivalent of 100 going out to the next process and 20% of 100 left in work in progress, whatever. You know, it'll be a lot easier to understand if you watch the video where I work the problems, but that's what we're doing. We're figuring out the equivalent units, which some will be whole units that actually went on, and some will be, based on what's sitting here on the assembly line, we've got 5 equivalent units or something like that, right? Okay. So the final steps, once you've figured out the physical flow and how many equivalent units are sitting around and got transferred and all that good stuff, you figure out the unit cost, right? So here's my total that I spent making those equivalent units. That will give me a unit cost for direct materials and conversion costs. And now I can apply those unit costs to the units transferred out, which are whole units, and the units still sitting there on the assembly line, which are however many equivalent units they are. I can apply that. And then I go back and I reconcile my cost to make sure I did it right. And that's it. It's going to be very logical. Like I said, I think if you watch me work it on the video for 6.31 and 6.32, I think it'll make a lot more sense. But we'll start with FIFO costing on the next video, which is what I do in 6.32. All right, so if you want to maybe jump over and watch that and come back or something, and maybe I can explain it, but it's pretty logical, and it's the way a factory flows, right? First in, first out. In reality, it does make a lot of sense. All right, so we'll come back and we'll talk about FIFO costing.